The helicopter dropped them off in a remote valley 15 miles from their target village at 2 o'clock in the morning. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the aircraft disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with Rodriguez's SEAL team in hostile territory. The silence was overwhelming after the constant noise of the helicopter rotors, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the mountains. Rodriguez gathered his team around him and reviewed their route one final time using a red-filtered flashlight that would not compromise their night vision. The village they were heading to was located in a narrow valley between two mountain ridges, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would be heavily monitored by enemy forces. Their plan was to approach from the north, using a goat trail that intelligence reports suggested was rarely patrolled. The team moved out in single file, with Rodriguez leading the way, and Sarah positioned in the middle of the formation for maximum protection. Each SEAL carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, radio gear, and supplies for a 3-day mission. Sarah carried a smaller pack containing her hairdressing equipment, civilian clothes, and basic survival gear. The terrain was challenging, with loose rocks and steep inclines that made silent movement difficult. The SEALs had trained for years in similar conditions, but Sarah found herself struggling to keep up with their pace. Her legs burned as they climbed steadily upward, and she had to focus on controlling her breathing to avoid making noise that might alert enemy sentries. After 3 hours of difficult hiking, the team reached a ridge overlooking their target village. Rodriguez signaled for everyone to take cover behind a cluster of large rocks while he surveyed the area through his night vision scope. The village appeared quiet, with only a few lights visible in the windows of scattered buildings. Intelligence reports had indicated that the target compound was located on the eastern edge of the village, near a small mosque. Rodriguez identified their destination and pointed out potential escape routes to his team. The compound was surrounded by a high wall with a single gate facing the main road. 2 guards were visible at the entrance, and thermal imaging suggested that additional personnel were inside the buildings. The team would need to establish observation posts that provided clear lines of sight to the compound, while remaining hidden from enemy patrols. The descent into the village took another 2 hours, as the team had to move slowly and carefully to avoid detection. They encountered several checkpoints along the way, but Rodriguez's intelligence had been accurate, and they were able to bypass these positions without being seen. Sarah's heart pounded every time they had to freeze in place while enemy patrols passed nearby. As dawn approached, the team reached the edge of the village and took cover in an abandoned building that had been damaged by previous fighting. Rodriguez sent 2 of his men to establish observation posts on opposite sides of the target compound, while the remaining team members prepared their equipment and established communication with their base. Sarah changed into her civilian clothes and prepared her hairdressing supplies. The plan called for Sarah to enter the village marketplace at mid-morning, when it would be busy enough for a new vendor to go unnoticed. She would set up a small station offering hair services to local women and children, which would allow the SEAL team to monitor the compound without arousing suspicion if anyone questioned her presence. She would explain that she was traveling through the area and hoping to earn some money before continuing her journey. Rodriguez reviewed the communication procedures with Sarah one final time. She carried a small radio hidden in her clothing that would allow her to receive updates from the team, though she would not be able to transmit unless there was an emergency. The SEALs would provide overwatch from their concealed positions and would intervene immediately if she appeared to be in danger. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Sarah walked nervously into the village marketplace carrying a small bag containing her scissors, combs, and mirrors. The marketplace was a collection of temporary stalls and blankets spread on the ground where local vendors sold vegetables, spices, cloth, and various household items. Women dressed in traditional clothing moved between the stalls, while children played nearby. Sarah found an empty space near the center of the marketplace and spread out a colorful blanket that Rodriguez had provided. She arranged her tools carefully and sat down to wait for customers, trying to appear calm while her heart raced with nervousness. Several women looked at her curiously, but no one approached during the first hour. Finally, a young mother with 2 small children stopped to examine Sarah's tools. Speaking in broken local dialect that she had practiced with the SEAL team's interpreter, Sarah offered to braid the woman's hair for a small fee. The woman seemed interested but hesitant, So Sarah demonstrated her skills by quickly braiding her own hair in an intricate pattern. Word spread quickly through the marketplace that there was a skilled hairdresser offering services. Within an hour, Sarah had a steady stream of customers wanting haircuts, braids, and styling. She worked carefully and efficiently, engaging in small talk with her customers while keeping one eye on the target compound, which was visible from her position in the marketplace. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear occasional updates from the SEAL team. They had successfully established observation posts and were monitoring activity at the compound. The target had not yet been spotted, but several armed men had entered and exited the building throughout the morning. Rodriguez's team was photographing everyone they saw and transmitting the images back to intelligence analysts at their base. As the day progressed, Sarah began to feel more comfortable in her role. Her customers seemed to accept her presence, and several women complimented her work and asked if she would be staying in the village for several days. Sarah explained that her travel plans were uncertain, which allowed her to keep her options open, depending on how the mission developed. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah noticed increased activity at the target compound. Several vehicles had arrived and armed men were taking positions around the perimeter. Through her earpiece, she heard Rodriguez's voice reporting that the target had been positively identified entering the main building. The mission was proceeding according to plan. However, Sarah also noticed that the atmosphere in the marketplace was beginning to change. Some of the vendors were packing up their goods earlier than usual, and several men who had been watching her throughout the day were now speaking quietly among themselves. She had the growing feeling that her presence had attracted unwanted attention. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece with a new concern. His spotters had identified enemy fighters moving into positions around the village perimeter. It appeared that their infiltration had been detected, though it was unclear whether the enemy knew about Sarah's connection to the SEAL team. Rodriguez ordered his men to prepare for possible extraction, while continuing to monitor the target compound. Sarah continued working with her current customer, a teenage girl who wanted an elaborate braided hairstyle for an upcoming wedding. She tried to maintain her composure while processing the implications of what she had heard through her radio. If the enemy knew about the SEAL team's presence, they were all in serious danger, and her position in the marketplace made her extremely vulnerable. The situation deteriorated rapidly when a group of armed men entered the marketplace and began questioning vendors about the new hairdresser. Sarah could see them approaching her position, and she knew that her cover story was about to be put to the ultimate test. Through her earpiece, she heard Rodriguez's urgent voice informing his team that they had been compromised and needed to prepare for immediate extraction under fire. Sarah Martinez never imagined that cutting hair on a military base would lead her into the middle of a combat zone. At 28 years old, she had been working as a civilian hairdresser at Forward Operating Base Alpha in Afghanistan for 8 months. The job paid well, and she needed the money to support her younger brother's college education back home in Texas. Every morning, Sarah would wake up in her small quarters and walk across the dusty compound to the makeshift salon she had set up in a converted shipping container. The walls were lined with mirrors she had purchased with her own money, and she had painted the interior a cheerful yellow to make the space feel more welcoming. Soldiers would come in throughout the day for haircuts, beard trims, and sometimes just to talk to someone who reminded them of home. Sarah had always been good with people. Growing up in a small town outside of Dallas, she had learned to cut hair from her grandmother, who ran the only beauty shop in their community. Her grandmother taught her that being a hairdresser meant being part therapist, part friend, and part artist. Sarah carried these lessons with her to Afghanistan, where homesick soldiers often opened up to her about their fears, their families, and their dreams of returning home safely. The base was located in a strategically important valley, surrounded by mountains that provided excellent cover for enemy forces. Sarah had been briefed on security protocols when she arrived, but her daily routine felt relatively safe. She worked during daylight hours, stayed within the designated civilian areas, and followed all the rules about where she could and could not go on the base. Captain James Rodriguez was one of her regular customers. He led a Navy SEAL team that had been stationed at the base for 3 months, conducting special operations in the surrounding region. Unlike some of the other soldiers who came to her salon, Rodriguez was quiet and professional. He never shared details about his missions, but Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes every time he sat in her chair. Rodriguez's team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with specialized skills in combat, communications, explosives, and medical care. They had been tasked with gathering intelligence on enemy movements in the area and disrupting supply lines that were being used to smuggle weapons and fighters across the border. It was dangerous work that required them to venture far from the safety of the base, often for days at a time. Sarah had noticed that Rodriguez seemed more tense than usual during his last few visits to her salon. He had been getting his hair cut more frequently, which she recognized as a sign that he was preparing for something important. Soldiers often wanted to look their best before major operations, partly out of pride and partly because they never knew if it might be their last haircut. The relationship between Sarah and the SEAL team was purely professional, but she had developed a genuine respect for these men who risked their lives every day. She made sure their haircuts were perfect, never charged them full price, and always had cold water and snacks available when they visited her salon. In return, they treated her with respect and made sure she felt safe on the base. One evening, as Sarah was closing up her salon for the day, Rodriguez approached her with an unusual request. His team had been assigned a mission that would take them deep into enemy territory, and they needed someone with specific skills to accompany them. The mission was classified, but he explained that they needed a civilian who could blend in with the local population and provide cover for their operations. Sarah listened carefully as Rodriguez explained that they had been monitoring a high-value target who was believed to be operating from a compound in a remote village. The target was a key figure in the local insurgency, responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Intelligence suggested that the compound was heavily guarded and that a direct assault would be too risky. The plan was for Rodriguez's team to infiltrate the village under cover of darkness and establish observation posts around the target compound. They would gather intelligence for several days before calling in an airstrike or planning a capture operation. However, they needed someone who could provide them with a legitimate reason to be in the village if they were discovered by enemy forces. Rodriguez explained that the village had a small marketplace where traveling merchants and service providers would sometimes set up temporary shops. A hairdresser would not be unusual in such a setting, particularly one who could serve the women and children in the community. Sarah's presence would give the SEAL team a cover story and allow them to operate more freely in the area. Sarah was initially reluctant to consider such a dangerous assignment. She had signed up to cut hair on a military base, not to participate in combat operations. However, Rodriguez assured her that her role would be purely supportive and that the team would take every precaution to ensure her safety. He also mentioned that the mission could potentially save many lives by removing a significant threat to coalition forces in the region. After thinking about it overnight, Sarah realized that this was an opportunity to make a real difference in the war effort. She had seen too many young soldiers come through her salon with injuries, trauma, and stories of friends who had been killed or wounded by the enemy forces that Rodriguez's team was targeting. If she could help eliminate a threat that was responsible for harming these brave men and women, she felt obligated to try. The next morning, Sarah informed Rodriguez that she would accept the mission. She spent the following week receiving intensive training from the SEAL team on basic survival skills, radio communication, and what to do in various emergency situations. They taught her how to use a pistol, though everyone hoped she would never need to fire it. They also provided her with civilian clothes that would help her blend in with the local population, and a cover story that she could use if questioned. As the day of the mission approached, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never been in a combat situation before, but she trusted Rodriguez and his team to keep her safe. She also knew that her participation in this mission represented something larger than herself, a chance to contribute meaningfully to the effort to bring peace and stability to this troubled region. The night before they were scheduled to depart, Sarah gave herself one last haircut in her salon mirror, wondering when she might see this place again. She packed her equipment carefully, including scissors, combs, and other tools that would make her cover story believable. Tomorrow, she would leave the relative safety of the base and venture into enemy territory with 8 Navy SEALs, not knowing that their mission would soon become a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. The armed men approached Sarah's position in the marketplace with obvious suspicion. She continued braiding the young girl's hair, forcing her hands to remain steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The leader of the group was a tall bearded man carrying an assault rifle who spoke to her in the local language. Sarah responded as she had been trained, explaining that she was a traveling hairdresser looking for work. The man's questions became more aggressive as he demanded to know where she had come from and where she was planning to go. Sarah stuck to her cover story, mentioning the names of villages that Rodriguez's team had provided during her training. However, she could see doubt in the man's eyes, and she knew that her accent and appearance were raising red flags. Through her hidden earpiece, Sarah heard Rodriguez's calm voice providing instructions. The SEAL team had eyes on her position and was prepared to intervene, but they needed her to try to extract herself from the situation peacefully if possible. A firefight in the middle of the marketplace would put dozens of innocent civilians at risk and would likely result in heavy casualties. The bearded man gestured for Sarah to pack up her belongings and come with him for further questioning. This was the moment she had dreaded most during her training. Once they moved her away from the public marketplace, her chances of survival would decrease dramatically. Sarah began slowly gathering her tools while buying time and hoping that Rodriguez's team could create a distraction. Suddenly, an explosion echoed from the direction of the target compound. The armed men immediately turned their attention toward the sound, speaking rapidly into their radio devices. Sarah realized that the SEAL team had initiated their assault on the compound, hoping to create enough chaos to allow her to escape. She used the momentary distraction to slip away from her blanket and move toward the edge of the marketplace. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece with urgent instructions to move toward a predetermined rally point behind the village mosque. The SEAL team would provide covering fire while she made her escape, but she needed to move quickly before the enemy forces could regroup and establish a perimeter around the entire village. Sarah abandoned her hairdressing equipment and ran through the narrow streets between mud brick buildings. Behind her, she could hear shouting voices and the sound of boots on stone as the armed men realized she had escaped their custody. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Rodriguez's team engaged enemy positions around the target compound. The village was quickly transforming into a combat zone. Civilians were running for cover, slamming doors and shuttering windows as bullets flew overhead. Sarah dodged between buildings, following the route that Rodriguez had shown her during their planning session. Her heart pounded as she heard enemy fighters shouting commands and coordinating their search for the American infiltrators. She reached the mosque and took cover behind its stone wall, breathing heavily from her sprint through the village. Through her earpiece, she could hear radio chatter from the SEAL team as they reported their positions and coordinated their assault on the compound. Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise, informing her that they had successfully captured their target, but were now surrounded by a much larger enemy force than intelligence had predicted. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Instead of facing the expected 12 to 15 enemy fighters, Rodriguez's team was now dealing with what appeared to be an entire company of well-armed insurgents. Enemy reinforcements were arriving from neighboring villages, and the SEALs were running low on ammunition. The original extraction plan was no longer viable, and they needed to find a new way out of the village. Sarah pressed herself against the mosque wall as enemy fighters ran past her position, searching for the American forces. She could see muzzle flashes from the compound area where Rodriguez's team was making their stand. The sound of automatic weapons fire was constant now, punctuated by occasional explosions from grenades and rocket-propelled grenades. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece with new instructions. The team was going to attempt a fighting withdrawal toward the northern edge of the village, where they had originally entered. Sarah needed to make her way to a backup rally point near an abandoned well about 300 yards from her current position. From there, they would attempt to extract as a group. Moving through the village had become extremely dangerous. Enemy fighters were now conducting a systematic search of every building, and several had taken up sniper positions on rooftops. Sarah waited for a lull in the nearby activity before leaving the cover of the mosque wall and continuing her movement toward the rally point. She had covered about half the distance when she encountered a group of enemy fighters moving through the same area. Sarah dove behind a pile of rubble from a bombed building just as the men turned the corner. She held her breath as they passed within feet of her hiding spot, discussing their search pattern in voices that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. After the fighters moved on, Sarah continued toward the rally point, But she could hear that the battle was intensifying. Rodriguez's team was reporting heavy contact from multiple directions, and their ammunition supplies were becoming critically low. The enemy forces had effectively surrounded them and were closing in from all sides. When Sarah finally reached the abandoned well that served as their backup rally point, she found it empty. Through her earpiece, she heard Rodriguez explaining that his team was pinned down in a building about 200 yards from the compound and unable to move. Enemy fighters had established a perimeter around their position and were preparing for a final assault. The situation was now desperate. Rodriguez's team had accomplished their primary mission by capturing the high-value target, but they were trapped in enemy territory with overwhelming odds against them. Sarah realized that she might be the only member of the American force who was still mobile and undetected by the enemy. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece with what sounded like final instructions. He provided her with the frequency for their backup communication channel and told her to contact their base for immediate extraction support. The team would continue to hold their position as long as possible, but they needed helicopter gunships and close air support within the next 30 minutes or they would likely be overrun. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. She was a civilian hairdresser who had volunteered for what was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission, and now she was the only hope for 8 highly trained Navy SEALs who were fighting for their lives. She had no military training beyond the basic instruction Rodriguez's team had provided, but she was their only link to the outside world. Using the radio procedures she had learned, Sarah established contact with the base and requested immediate close air support and extraction for Rodriguez's team. The response was not encouraging. Enemy air defenses in the area had increased significantly, and helicopter operations would be extremely risky. The earliest that air support could arrive would be 45 minutes, and extraction helicopters would need at least an hour. Rodriguez's team did not have an hour. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing as enemy forces pressed their attack. The SEALs were conserving ammunition and fighting from prepared positions, but they were heavily outnumbered and completely surrounded. Sarah knew that if she was going to help them survive, she would need to do something to change the tactical situation. Looking around the village from her position near the well, Sarah began to formulate a desperate plan. She had noticed several fuel storage tanks near the marketplace during her earlier movement through the area. If she could create a significant distraction by causing an explosion, it might draw some of the enemy forces away from Rodriguez's position and give the SEALs a chance to break out of their encirclement. Sarah knew that her plan to create a distraction was extremely dangerous, but she could hear through her earpiece that Rodriguez's team was running out of time. The enemy fighters were coordinating a final assault, and several SEALs had already reported injuries from the intense firefight. She had to act quickly if she wanted to give them any chance of survival. Moving carefully through the village streets, Sarah made her way back toward the marketplace where she had noticed the fuel storage tanks earlier. The area was now crawling with enemy fighters, but most of them were focused on the ongoing battle near the compound. She used the smoke and confusion to her advantage, moving from cover to cover while avoiding the main roads. The fuel tanks were located behind a small building that served as a supply depot for the local population. Sarah could see that they contained diesel fuel and cooking gas, both of which would create significant explosions if ignited properly. However, she needed to find a way to set them off without getting killed in the process. Rodriguez had taught her basic demolition techniques during her training, including how to use improvised explosive devices. Sarah searched through the debris around the supply depot until she found some electrical wire and a small battery from a broken radio. She carefully rigged a simple timing device using components from her watch and connected it to one of the gas tanks. The work was nerve-wracking because enemy fighters kept passing near her position, and she could hear the battle intensifying in the distance. Through her earpiece, Rodriguez reported that his team was down to their last magazines of ammunition, and that enemy forces were preparing for a coordinated assault from 3 directions. Time was running out. Sarah finished her improvised explosive device and set the timer for 3 minutes, which would give her enough time to reach a safe distance before the explosion. She then used her radio to warn Rodriguez's team about the incoming distraction and advised them to be ready to move when the explosion drew enemy attention away from their position. She ran toward a cluster of rocks about 200 yards from the fuel depot. diving for cover just as her improvised bomb detonated. The explosion was much larger than she had expected, creating a massive fireball that lit up the entire village and sent shockwaves through the surrounding buildings. Secondary explosions followed as the other fuel tanks ignited, creating a series of blasts that could be heard for miles. The distraction worked exactly as Sarah had hoped. Enemy fighters throughout the village immediately turned their attention toward the burning depot, assuming they were under attack from American aircraft or artillery. Many of the fighters who had been surrounding Rodriguez's position abandoned their post to investigate the explosions and help fight the spreading fires. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece with urgent instructions for his team to begin their breakout attempt. The SEALs moved quickly through the gaps in the enemy perimeter, using the confusion and reduced visibility from the smoke to mask their movement. However, they were still outnumbered and would need continued support to reach the extraction point. Sarah realized that she could provide additional assistance by creating more diversions throughout the village. She began moving toward another target, a small ammunition cache that she had noticed near the mosque. If she could detonate those supplies, it would create another major distraction and further disrupt the enemy's ability to coordinate their response. However, as she moved through the village, Sarah encountered a group of enemy fighters who were conducting a systematic search for the American infiltrators. Unlike her previous encounters, this group spotted her immediately and began pursuing her through the narrow streets. She ran as fast as she could, using her knowledge of the village layout to stay ahead of her pursuers. The chase led her through a maze of interconnected courtyards and alleyways. Sarah's smaller size allowed her to squeeze through gaps that slowed down the larger men pursuing her, but she could hear them getting closer. Her lungs burned from the exertion, and she knew she could not maintain this pace much longer. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece, reporting that his team had successfully broken out of their encirclement and was moving toward the northern extraction point. However, they were still being pursued by enemy forces and would need close air support to complete their escape. The helicopters were still 20 minutes away, and the team needed to find a defensible position where they could hold out until help arrived. Sarah's pursuit through the village continued as she tried to reach the ammunition cache near the mosque. She could hear her pursuers shouting coordinates to other enemy units, and she realized that they were trying to surround her just as they had done to Rodriguez's team. She needed to find a way to break contact with her pursuers, or she would be trapped. Thinking quickly, Sarah remembered a drainage tunnel that she had noticed during her earlier movement through the village. The tunnel was narrow and partially flooded, but it might allow her to escape her immediate pursuers and reach the mosque without being detected. She changed direction and headed toward the tunnel entrance, which was hidden behind a pile of construction materials. The tunnel was even more challenging than she had expected. The water was knee-deep and ice-cold, and the tunnel was so narrow that she had to crawl through some sections. However, it provided complete concealment from the enemy fighters who were searching for her above ground. She could hear them shouting in frustration as they lost her trail. After 10 minutes of difficult movement through the tunnel, Sarah emerged near the mosque and quickly located the ammunition cache. It was a small bunker built into the side of a hill, containing rockets, grenades, and small arms ammunition. She used the same techniques Rodriguez had taught her to rig another improvised explosive device, this time using components from a grenade she found in the cache. The second explosion was even more spectacular than the first. The ammunition cache detonated in a chain reaction that sent rockets and tracer rounds flying in all directions, creating a fireworks display that could be seen for miles. The explosion also started several fires in nearby buildings, adding to the chaos and confusion throughout the village. Through her earpiece, Sarah heard Rodriguez reporting that the diversions had been extremely effective. His team had reached a defensible position on a hilltop north of the village and was preparing to hold that position until air support arrived. However, enemy forces were regrouping and beginning to pursue them toward the extraction point. Sarah knew that she needed to reach Rodriguez's position as quickly as possible. The team would need all the help they could get to hold off the enemy forces until the helicopters arrived. She began moving north through the village, using the ongoing fires and explosions to mask her movement while avoiding the search teams that were still looking for her. The route to Rodriguez's position took her through some of the most dangerous areas in the village. Enemy fighters were establishing roadblocks and checkpoints at all the major intersections, and patrols were moving systematically through every neighborhood. Sarah had to use all of her training and intuition to avoid detection, while covering the 2 miles between her position and the extraction point. As she moved through the outskirts of the village, Sarah could see tracer rounds flying back and forth in the distance, where Rodriguez's team was making their stand. The sound of automatic weapons fire was constant, punctuated by the occasional explosion of grenades and rockets. She could tell from the intensity of the firefight that the enemy forces had found the SEALs' position and were pressing their attack. Sarah pushed herself harder, knowing that every minute counted. The helicopters were still 15 minutes away, and Rodriguez's team was facing overwhelming odds. She had already done more than anyone could have expected from a civilian, but she knew that the mission was not over yet. The 8 Navy SEALs who had trusted her with their lives were still in mortal danger, and she was determined to do everything in her power to help them survive. Sarah reached the base of the hill where Rodriguez's team had established their defensive position, just as the enemy forces launched their coordinated assault. The SEALs had chosen their position well, using natural rock formations and sparse vegetation to create overlapping fields of fire, but they were facing at least 50 enemy fighters who were attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear the controlled chaos of military communications as Rodriguez's team coordinated their defense. Each SEAL was calling out enemy positions, ammunition status, and tactical updates while maintaining disciplined fire to conserve their remaining bullets. Despite their training and tactical advantages, the mathematics of the situation were working against them. Sarah began climbing the rocky slope toward the SEAL position, using the same movement techniques Rodriguez had taught her during training. She stayed low and moved during lulls in the enemy fire, using natural cover to mask her approach. Several times she had to freeze in place as enemy fighters moved past her position, their attention focused on the hilltop battle above. Rodriguez spotted her approaching and used his radio to guide her toward a safe route up the hill. His voice was calm and professional despite the intensity of the firefight, providing her with precise directions to avoid the areas where enemy fire was most concentrated. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the SEAL positions as they returned fire at targets she could not see. When Sarah finally reached the defensive perimeter, she found Rodriguez's team spread out among the rocks in a roughly circular formation. Each SEAL had established a fighting position that provided protection from enemy fire, while allowing them to engage targets approaching from their assigned sector. The team's medic was treating 2 wounded men who had been hit by enemy rifle fire during the breakout from the village. Rodriguez quickly briefed Sarah on the tactical situation. Enemy forces had surrounded their position and were advancing up the hill from 3 different directions. The SEALs had good fields of fire and defensive positions, but they were critically low on ammunition and had no heavy weapons to counter the rocket-propelled grenades that the enemy was using against them. The helicopters carrying reinforcements and ammunition were still 10 minutes away, but Rodriguez was not certain his team could hold their position that long. Enemy forces were getting closer with each assault, and several had reached positions within grenade range of the SEAL perimeter. The team needed something to break the enemy momentum and buy them additional time. Sarah asked Rodriguez what she could do to help, and he explained that they needed someone to call in precise coordinates for the incoming air support. The team's radio operator had been wounded, and Rodriguez needed to focus on commanding the defensive battle. Sarah had learned basic radio procedures during her training, and her position in the center of the perimeter would give her good visibility of the entire battlefield. Rodriguez handed Sarah the team's long-range radio and showed her how to contact the approaching helicopters. The pilots needed accurate information about enemy positions, friendly locations, and the best approach routes to avoid being shot down by enemy fire. Sarah would serve as the team's forward air controller, coordinating the air support that would hopefully turn the tide of the battle. The responsibility was overwhelming, but Sarah knew that Rodriguez's team was counting on her. She established radio contact with the lead helicopter pilot and began providing updates on the tactical situation. The pilot asked for specific information about enemy positions, weapon systems, and any obstacles that might interfere with their attack runs. Using binoculars that Rodriguez provided, Sarah began systematically identifying and reporting enemy positions to the incoming aircraft. She could see enemy fighters moving through the rocks below the SEAL position, carrying rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. Some had reached positions less than 50 yards from the defensive perimeter. The first helicopter appeared on the horizon, just as enemy forces launched what appeared to be their final assault. Sarah watched through the binoculars as dozens of fighters began moving up the hill simultaneously, using covering fire and tactical movement to close the distance to the SEAL position. Rodriguez's team increased their rate of fire, but they were clearly being overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. Sarah coordinated the helicopter's first attack run, providing the pilot with precise coordinates for the largest concentration of enemy fighters. The aircraft swooped down from the north, its machine guns and rockets creating devastating effects among the attacking forces. The assault faltered as enemy fighters dove for cover and tried to reorganize their attack. However, the enemy forces quickly adapted to the air threat. Several fighters produced shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles and began engaging the helicopters, forcing the pilots to maintain greater distances and limiting their effectiveness. Sarah realized that the air support alone would not be sufficient to break the enemy attack. Rodriguez's team was now engaged in close-quarters combat as enemy fighters reached their defensive perimeter. Sarah could see SEALs firing at targets just yards away while others used knives and hand-to-hand combat techniques to defend their positions. The disciplined defensive fire had given way to desperate individual battles for survival. Sarah made a critical decision that went far beyond her role as a radio operator. She grabbed one of the wounded SEAL's rifles and moved to a gap in the defensive line where enemy fighters were attempting to break through. Despite having only basic firearms training, she began engaging targets with careful, aimed shots that helped maintain the integrity of the perimeter. Her actions freed up Rodriguez to coordinate the defense more effectively and call in additional air support from the second helicopter that had just arrived. The combined effects of accurate defensive fire and coordinated air attacks finally began to turn the tide of the battle. Enemy forces started withdrawing down the hill, carrying their wounded and leaving behind several bodies. The battle was not over, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Rodriguez's team used the lull in fighting to redistribute ammunition, treat wounded personnel, and prepare for the possibility of another enemy assault. Sarah continued coordinating with the helicopters, which were now providing overwatch and reconnaissance to identify any enemy reinforcements approaching the area. After 30 minutes of relative quiet, Rodriguez received word that a full extraction package was en route to their position. Heavy-lift helicopters were bringing additional troops and supplies, while attack helicopters would provide cover during the extraction operation. The team had accomplished their mission and would soon be heading back to safety. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as she realized that they had survived one of the most intense combat situations imaginable. She had entered this mission as a civilian volunteer with minimal training, but she had proven herself under fire and played a crucial role in keeping Rodriguez's team alive. The 8 Navy SEALs who had trusted her with their lives were all going home. Rodriguez approached Sarah as they waited for the extraction helicopters and expressed his gratitude for her performance during the mission. He explained that her quick thinking, courage under fire, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances had made the difference between success and disaster. Without her diversions in the village and her coordination of air support on the hilltop, his team would not have survived. The extraction went smoothly, with Sarah and the SEAL team being lifted out of the combat zone without further incident. As their helicopter climbed away from the battlefield, Sarah looked down at the village where she had spent the most terrifying and important day of her life. She knew that she would never be the same person who had volunteered for what she thought would be a simple reconnaissance mission. The mission had been a complete success from a military perspective. Rodriguez's team had captured their high-value target, disrupted a major enemy operation, and eliminated dozens of enemy fighters. However, Sarah knew that the real victory was that all 9 members of their team were returning home alive, against odds that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Back at Forward Operating Base Alpha, Sarah found herself struggling to process everything that had happened during the mission. The debriefing sessions with intelligence officers lasted for hours as they documented every detail of the operation, from the initial infiltration to the final extraction. Sarah's role in the mission's success had far exceeded anything the planners had anticipated. Rodriguez's team had successfully captured their high-value target, who turned out to be a key figure in coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence gathered from the compound raid provided information that led to several follow-up operations, disrupting enemy networks and saving countless lives. The mission was being hailed as one of the most successful special operations conducted in that area of Afghanistan. However, Sarah was having difficulty adjusting to normal life on the base after experiencing such intense combat. Simple activities like cutting hair in her salon seemed surreal after spending hours under enemy fire, coordinating airstrikes and fighting for her life alongside Navy SEALs. The contrast between her peaceful daily routine and the violence she had experienced was jarring. Rodriguez visited Sarah's salon a few days after the mission to check on her well-being. He could see that she was struggling with what psychologists call post-traumatic stress, a normal reaction to the abnormal experiences she had endured. He arranged for her to speak with the base's mental health professionals and made sure she understood that her reactions were completely normal. The base commander, Colonel Williams, also visited Sarah to personally thank her for her extraordinary service. He explained that her actions had not only saved the lives of 8 Navy SEALs, but had also contributed to a significant intelligence victory that would protect many other service members. He offered to recommend her for civilian honors and suggested that she might consider a career in military intelligence. Sarah was surprised to learn that word of her heroic actions had spread throughout the base and beyond. Soldiers who visited her salon treated her with a new level of respect, and many wanted to hear first-hand accounts of the mission. She found it difficult to talk about the experience, particularly the moments when she had been forced to take up arms and engage enemy fighters in combat. The media attention was even more overwhelming. Military public affairs officers approached Sarah about telling her story to reporters, explaining that her example could inspire other civilians to support military operations and demonstrate the courage of ordinary Americans serving in combat zones. Sarah was reluctant to seek publicity, but understood the value of sharing her experience. Rodriguez helped Sarah understand that her transformation from civilian hairdresser to combat veteran was part of a larger story about the nature of modern warfare. In conflicts like Afghanistan, the lines between combatants and non-combatants often blurred, and civilians frequently found themselves in situations that required military-level courage and skill. After much consideration, Sarah agreed to participate in a limited number of interviews with military journalists. She wanted to ensure that the focus remained on the professionalism and heroism of Rodriguez's SEAL team, rather than on her own actions. She emphasized that she had simply done what anyone in her position would have done to help save lives. The interviews revealed that Sarah's background as a hairdresser had actually provided her with valuable skills for the mission. Her ability to read people, engage in casual conversation, and blend into social situations had made her cover story believable. Her experience dealing with stressful situations in her salon had also helped her remain calm under pressure during the mission. Rodriguez's team returned to the United States shortly after the mission, but they maintained contact with Sarah through letters and emails. Each SEAL expressed his personal gratitude for her actions and credited her with saving their lives. Several team members invited her to visit their families when she returned home, wanting their wives and children to meet the woman who had brought their husbands and fathers home safely. The captured high-value target provided intelligence that led to the disruption of several planned attacks against American forces. Information gathered from the raid also helped coalition forces locate and destroy weapons caches, training camps, and communication networks that had been supporting enemy operations throughout the region. Sarah's contribution to this intelligence victory was recognized in classified military reports. As her tour of duty at the base neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective on military service had changed. She had arrived in Afghanistan as a civilian contractor, looking to earn money for her brother's education, but she was leaving as someone who had experienced combat and understood the sacrifices that military personnel made every day. Sarah decided to extend her contract and remain at the base for an additional 6 months. She wanted to continue supporting the troops who visited her salon, and felt that her experience had given her a unique ability to understand and relate to their challenges. Her salon became an informal counseling center where soldiers could talk about their experiences with someone who truly understood what they were going through. The base's mental health professionals asked Sarah to participate in training programs for other civilian contractors, sharing her insights about adapting to dangerous situations and managing stress in combat environments. Her perspective as someone who had successfully transitioned from civilian to combatant and back again was valuable for preparing others who might face similar challenges. Rodriguez visited Sarah's salon one final time before his team deployed to another assignment. He thanked her again for her service and presented her with a Navy SEAL Trident pin, an honor rarely given to civilians. He explained that she had earned the right to be considered an honorary member of the SEAL community through her actions during the mission. When Sarah finally returned home to Texas, she found that her experience in Afghanistan had changed her career goals completely. She used the money she had earned and the educational benefits available to veterans to pursue a degree in international relations and military studies. She wanted to continue serving her country in roles that would allow her to support military operations and protect service members. Her hometown welcomed her back as a hero, and she was invited to speak at schools, veterans organizations, and community events about her experiences. Sarah always emphasized that heroism could be found in ordinary people who were willing to step up when others needed help. She credited her grandmother's lessons about service and caring for others as the foundation for her actions in Afghanistan. Sarah eventually joined the State Department as a civilian intelligence analyst, using her unique experience and perspective to support military operations around the world. She never forgot the lesson she learned on that hilltop in Afghanistan, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were willing to risk everything to help others. Years later, Sarah maintained contact with Rodriguez and his team members, attending reunions and staying connected to the SEAL community that had adopted her as one of their own. She often reflected on how a simple decision to volunteer for what seemed like a routine mission had changed her life completely and led her to discover courage she never knew she possessed. The mission remained classified for several years, but Sarah's story eventually became part of military training programs designed to teach soldiers about the importance of civilian-military cooperation and the potential for non-combatants to contribute to mission success. Her example inspired other civilians to volunteer for dangerous assignments in support of military operations around the world.